out of the blue, there sits this man across from me, and we get chatting at the hotel, I think, in the morning over breakfast, and he told me some great stories about Holman Moody back in the 60s, and he's going to share a little bit of that with you tonight, and also what they're working on in the future. So, Mr. Lee Holman.
Much. I never know what to talk about when I come to these events because I don't know how many of you know the history of the company or where the company came from, but the company has always been in business. We've always been open since 1957. We continue to make Ford, primarily Ford products and Ford pieces. The company was founded by my father and Ralph Moody. But it really goes back beyond that because my father was a tool and die maker in California, worked for Duntov, worked for Lou Agile, who was a famous racer back in the 40s. And they raced unlimited hydroplanes, or at the time it was a regular motorboat, and raced all over the country. And my father drove trucks, and he ended up working for Duntov as a tool and die maker, doing the castings for the Duntov heads for the flathead. Ended up working for Bill Strop and Associates on the Mexican road race. Strop and Associates also worked with Clay Smith, who's the famous Woody Woodpecker decal people see. Very few people know that that's really a genius camshaft designer, Clay Smith, who was killed in a tragic accident in Indianapolis on pit road. But my father, through his association with Bill Strop, did the Mexican road race Lincolns. Went to Indianapolis with Bill Vukovich. He was on the pit crew with Bill Vukovich when Vuki was killed. And as a kid, I was invited on weekends to go into Bill Strop's shop on Signal Hill in California and play on creepers rolling under the Mexican road race Lincolns and just wander around and got to know racing and got to know the cars. In 1956, my father was offered a position to take over what was called Apollo Engineering on the East Coast. It was Ford's marketing guru at the time was Peter DiPaolo, who won Indianapolis in the 20s. My father accepted the job. No one else really wanted it. It was offered to Chuck Day and any number of famous Ford racers on the West Coast. And my father came out and found that Ford couldn't win a race. TK was dominating and Ford was sort of on the back burner. And he took all the cars off the track, rebuilt them his way, and instantly started winning. And so from the summer of '56 to the summer of '57, they dominated racing in NASCAR on the East Coast. And it got to be so one-sided that the other factories said, this isn't fair, we're not doing it. You just can't keep going like this. So they talked Ford into getting out of racing. One of many times that Ford has come in and gotten out, and come in and gotten out. They seem to not know how good racing is for them. So they got out of racing, and my father, running Apollo Engineering, had Curtis Turner, Joe Weatherly, Fireball Roberts, Marvin Panch, Bill Amick, all these famous drivers driving for them. And Ford said, well, give them each a car, give them each a pickup truck. And they did that. And there were still 7 or 8 cars left over and some tools in the factory. And so my father and Ralph Moody went together, bought the surplus inventory, and continued racing. In 1958, I was at the beach in Daytona when we had Curtis Turner and Joe Weatherly in 2 58 Fords. On Saturday's race, they finished first and third. And the next day, the same 2 cars with new engines, new rear ends, everything changed out, but physically the same 2 cars, finished second and fourth with the same 2 drivers. And because our company has never thrown out any of these old archives or any of the old stuff, in my collection of checks, I have the per diem expense checks paying Joe Weatherly and Curtis Turner for 3 days travel expense money to be in Daytona in 1958. Each check is for $45. But at the time to win the race, probably paid less than $1,000. '58, Ford had realized that they had been diddled and that they really should be back in racing. So they started feeding Holman and Moody products in the back door. And giving Holman and Moody unlimited access to what we thought we wanted to have. And that was the one unique thing that Holman and Moody, that my father was able to do with Ford Motor Company. He developed a relationship with a number of managers, but they included Henry II. And we ended up with the power to go into a Ford factory and shut it down until they made what we wanted. And they were told, don't ask. If John Holman asked for it, do it. And so when we wanted to make the Monte Carlo Falcons in 1964, we went to the Falcon assembly plant and shut it down and made the next 15 cars identical Rally Falcons. Heater deletes, no undercoating, the things that we wanted to make a better race driver. Now the genius in this type of thing was, my father had developed friendships with people like George Merlin, a famous Ford marketing guy who was Ford's liaison with J. Walter Thompson. And Merwin had the talent of getting the paperwork completed. Because one of the problems you have if you make 15 rally cars, the FIA requires 1,000 of this class, or 100 of that class. And so my father could get the 15 made that really did the rallying. George Merwin could get the paperwork done proving that we made 500 or 1,000 or whatever. And one weekend, Mr. Merwin, who was an hysterical person, got documentation where the cars had been produced, imported from Canada, all the seals, all the stamps, everything done, so that we had, and I think it was 500 of Falcons that we had to have in order to run them in the Monte Carlo rallies. The connections that we developed in Ford, and the fact that you could in fact go to Ford and say, this is what we want, this is what we're going to do, allowed us to win. And it allowed us to win over and over and over again. Holman and Moody primarily was in NASCAR. And so they would decide, we need to win some boat races. So Henry Ford would say, go race some boats and send us a bill, but you need to win. And the same thing happened on the Monte Carlo Rally. In '63, we went over for the first time to Monte Carlo with some Falcons, and we had already been racing Falcons. We had already taken a Fairlane 221, later the 260, put it in a small Falcon that we had sectioned. We took a few inches out of the middle of it, on the scallop side. We took a little out of the roof, and then we made a fastback out of it. And we raced it at Nassau against the Ferrari GTOs. We won. Earlier in '57, we had the Battlebirds, the '57 T-Birds that we were sports car racing. There were two of them, aluminum bodies stamped at the Ford factory. The bodies were then put on standard cars by Troutman and Barnes in California. And we ended up with them. And we raced those at New Smyrna. That was a little funny because we had Curtis Turner driving, and Turner had a habit of leaning on other cars in the corner. And in sports car races, you're not supposed to do that. And so they black flagged him, and he came in and cussed out the flagman because he said, I came down here to race these boys. I didn't come down here to kiss them. And so they wouldn't let him race. So we brought in Fireball Roberts, who lived near New Smyrna. He lived in Daytona. And at that event, my father's good friend, Argus Duntov, was there with the Corvettes. Carroll Shelby was there with a Ferrari, because he was driving in his bib overalls with Ferrari. The Thunderbird won. It's fun because we just did a talk up in Williamsburg, the Ford and Ferrari Wars. Well, Holman and Moody had been racing Ferrari for a long time, and we normally did what we were supposed to do. The Battlebirds became a real point of contention for me personally, because my father owned them both. And if you can imagine what a full race, Halibrand kidney beam knockoff wheel, aluminum body 57 Thunderbird would be worth. I can tell you that when I turned 16, my father didn't want me to beg and bitch about not being able to drive one of them, so he sold them for $1,800 a piece. One of them just sold for over $500,000. The other was destroyed. The other was destroyed making an Elvis movie. And it was written off so early in the movie that it was written out of the movie. So there's no footage available of this 57 T-bird creation. But just absolutely gorgeous cars. The Falcon project became interesting because there wasn't a Falcon V8, except we made them. And so we made, I told you about the Challenger 3, which was the fastback version. I personally, my favorite was Challenger 2, because it was sectioned in the middle, and so that the body was shortened. Had a 221 V8 with a 4-on-the-floor transmission. And I was given that to drive to high school for a month to make sure that it didn't overheat, that it didn't have any problems. If you can imagine a 16-year-old kid at Marysburg High School in Charlotte, North Carolina, with the only V8 Falcon on the road in the world. I had a little trouble dealing with it. Didn't get any tickets, but it was still a lot of fun. That car was so nice and so much fun that it was sent up to Detroit and was taken to the proving grounds, and all of the Ford engineers that were working on the new top secret production car drove it and loved it. And it actually became the prototype for the driving Mustang. And that's the reason that the early Mustangs, which in their pre-production program were all going to be 6-cylinders. You were going to have primarily 6-cylinder cars the first year, with the second year an improvement to the V8. Well, that little Challenger 2 was such a neat little car that Ford hopped up the Mustang, and it became a V8 primary car. It primarily had that engine in it. Our success in the rallies in Europe was phenomenal. We didn't win nothing for the overall events, but we won all the special stages because the cars were so quick and handled so well. Our problem was that Holman and Moody's mechanics couldn't carry a Dixie cup with chewing tobacco on a flight to Europe. They didn't know how to eat. I've got a letter in the files from Eddie Pagan, who was a famous race driver from the West Coast, who worked for my father. We sent him over to Paris working with Henri Chenin. He had a 4-star hotel that Ford of France had set him at. Fabulous French food. And I have a letter in the files from Eddie Pagan asking my father, pleading with my father to please, when you send over the new starter motors and the new shock absorber assemblies that we need, could you put some pork and beans in with them? We can't stand it. I'm starving, John, get me something. So we determined that our guys couldn't do well in Europe. They just didn't know how to travel well. So we subcontracted with one of my father's friends, Alan Mann, of Alan Mann Racing. And he ended up running the Falcons for us on the Monte Carlo Rally. Jim Rose, who was here today with a sort of a cream yellow Falcon, was one of the crew chiefs on those. And he was on the Monte Carlo with that style car, and later with the 64 cars. And he ran the Monte, the Sophie Liage, all the rallies in Europe. What we did was win special stages. On all these rallies, you'd have a hill climb. You'd rally from point A to point B, and the Mini Coopers, the Volvos, the Saabs would clean our clocks because they were used to the system. But when you got to grunt horsepower going up a hill or going around a racetrack, we would win the special stages. And it got so bad at one point that BMC, which won the rally in '64 with the Mini Cooper, took ads out saying, we won the damn thing, they didn't. And Ford Berlin with Ford of America had all these ads and all this promotional stuff where Ford Falcons win this stage, win that stage, win that stage, and when you see it in print, it really comes out where we won the rally. one of the reasons the Falcons continue today to be so dominant in European racing is because we cheated. And we didn't cheat a little, we cheated a lot. And if you look, there's some, Ford had to produce owner's manuals and parts service books and all these things for the 15 cars, which would be the 500 that were produced. And so a lot of the part numbers, if you see the Ford documents, it says C4HM 6220. That was a Holman Moody part. You bought it through Holman Moody. That was the correct assembly part for that Falcon. We cheated, in fact, so bad that in 1965 we were caught. And the 65 Falcons were never allowed to rally because the cars, the homologation papers and everything were just so bogus that they caught us. Chrysler actually protested, and that's how we were caught. But it's funny because today, those homologation papers are the copy that survived. And the FIA in Europe doesn't recognize that that's a car that wasn't allowed to run. And so the Falcon today can have bigger brakes, more horsepower, and lighter than a Mustang. And that's why so many people in Europe run the Falcon rather than a Mustang. Because they're able to go on a set of rules that were illegal to begin with. The other thing that's funny about that is, we did it so well that George Merwin smuggled us some Mustangs. And so we got some pre-production Mustang prototypes. We sent them to Alan Mann, and he put the Holman Moody running gear and engines in these Mustangs and entered the Tour de France in 1964 before the Mustang had been introduced in America. We won it. We finished first, second, and third, with Henry Gruyere driving the winning car. Bo Lundfeld actually won, but at one point his car wouldn't start, and spectators had push started it, and that was illegal, so they penalized him so many seconds, which put him down in third place. What's interesting about that is, from our standpoint, is that we won the first race ever with a Mustang. The sad part is, the winning car was sent to Carroll Shelby in America, straight from Paris. And that's what they copied to make the GT350. And I don't see anywhere on any of the cars a little note saying, designed by Holman and Moody, serviced by Alan Mann. But in fact, we did the first winning Mustang. We carried on in NASCAR. We had, at the time that this was going on, 1965, 66 era, we had 450 employees. We had 3 facilities, one in California because we bought out Bill Stropp, one in Miami for boat racing, and one in Charlotte. We were racing in NASCAR, racing in drag racing by accident, racing in the Monte Carlo and sports car races. The drag racing was an accident because we were doing some Falcons, some 427 Falcons, a couple of Mustangs. But in NASCAR, in order to beat the Chrysler Hemi, Ford came up with a single overhead cam, the sock motor. NASCAR said you have to make 500 of them for it to be a legal dealer-installed option for a car. So we built 500 new single overhead cam, or Ford built and sent down to us. 500 of these camera motors. We put them in a NASCAR car, went to Atlanta, and won the race too easily. NASCAR said, "You've had your fun, don't bring them back." Well, what do you do if you got 500 motors that NASCAR won't let you play with? You invent the funny car. So we built the FX Mustangs and set up a production line and started running the FX Mustangs just to have a place to blow up the camera motors. And Tom Todd wrote a very nice book about Holman Moody. And in the book, there's a photograph of my dad standing in front of our Ford warehouse, because at that time, in our 250,000 square foot facility, we had $7 million in a Ford factory warehouse inside our building. And all of those camera motors were stacked up in racks. And there's a picture of my father standing in front of 500 camera motors. And we ended up blowing up quite a few in racing. The most famous blow up was one nobody really ever heard about. We were playing with Connecticut on our dyno with a camera motor to see if you could make nitrous oxide work. Nitrous oxide puts oxygen into the chamber and adds horsepower. And normally it's not that destructive. Normally it doesn't really light the thing up. But in this case, it had never been tried before on an engine like this. So we're sitting there with this full-blown, supercharged, single overhead cam with a little red button that pumped the nitrous oxide and the extra gasoline into it. And it was running about 6,500 to 7,000 under full load with a Heenan and Freud dyno, and Coletta pushed the button, and it never hit another lick. It exploded the heads off. It lifted the intake off. It sheared the flywheel bolts, and the flywheel went running around the dyno cell like a buzzsaw. And Coletta turned to my dad and said, "Wasn't that special?" It's those sort of things that sort of bring racing back to you. It's just sort of touching. In NASCAR, we had the best. We had everyone from Jimmy Clark, golf course at Rockingham. We had David Pearson, Farrell Roberts, Fred Lorenzen. But we also, in the sports car end of it, had Mark Donahue, A.J. Foyt, Parnelli Jones, Dan Gurney. We had so many very famous drivers, and all of them, to a person, said, "Damn, I wish I could drive a Holman Moody car." Mark Donahue sent a letter on Griffith Motor Car stationery critiquing the GT40 Mark II. He drove for us at Le Mans in '66. And he said, "These are the problems. This is what needs to be changed. You shouldn't have the door go into the roof like that, because you can't get out if you're upside down." So we made the passenger door on the Mark IIB two-piece door, so that the roof was a separate panel, so if it was upside down, you could get out of it. But to me, the joy is having a letter from Mark Donahue to my father. And at the end of the letter, he said, "Could I please continue to drive for Holman and Moody?" He wanted to be an R team car. The way it worked in the GT40 program and a lot of programs at Ford, you generally had two groups of people fighting for the money in Ford Motor Company. You had the marketing people, in the case of Shelby and Holman and Moody in that era, it was Lee Iacocca in marketing, and he was backing Carroll Shelby because Ford had bought Carroll Shelby. Ford owned the company, and Shelby was a figurehead of a person to promote. And that's fair enough, because they never owned Holman and Moody. There was never any advantage for Ford to promote Holman and Moody. We were backed by Bill Ennis, engine and foundry, because he knew we'd get the job done. And so a lot of the rivalry, a lot of the concern that happened when we were building the GT40 and when those projects were under construction were based not on a rivalry between Shelby and Holman and Moody, but more between engineering and E&F, engine and foundry at Ford, wanting to control the budget, and Lee Iacocca wanting to control the budget. And every once in a while, Henry Ford would just call a truce and say, "Okay, guys, wait a second, we're going to split the baby. You get some, and let's go play racing." Henry backed our company to a great extent, and so much of what we did, so much of what we achieved, was done because we had a free hand to go do it. When we found that the single overhead cam engines, the high-rise 427s, could turn 7,500 RPM, we could win races, but the motor blew up fairly regularly. You just couldn't get them to live. Because at that speed, the crankshaft becomes an oil pump. It slings the oil out centrifugally faster than the main bearing could supply it. So we hand-made some side orders to put a bigger vein down the block to feed more oil to the bearing. That allowed those engines to turn 8,000. So then we went into E&F, in the engine and foundry, and the Rouge plant, and hand-rubbed the sand cores. Because again, Holman Moody's technicians could go to the Rouge plant and say, wait a second, we're going to change this. And the Ford would let us. It was amazing to have that power. So we developed the side oiler with D.A. Sullivan, Ford Motor Company, a brilliant engineer, an older gentleman that worked at Ford. He actually worked at Ford on the original flathead V8. We would just take any problem, anything that needed attacking, and we'd go attack it and get the cars, get the product to where we could finish the race. And if it meant winning in NASCAR, we did what it took to win there. If it meant winning at Indianapolis, we helped there. We never actually ran a car at Indy, but I did work on some of them myself personally. But the company never did. What surprises me, though, is when you see the quality today of the new products, of the new cars, that have gone beyond the technology we have. And you see the new Ford GT, you see the new Mustang, and they've got more horsepower, more performance, better performance than we ever dreamed of, as much as we were cheating. you people today with the modern cars are really living in the prime time for this type of performance. I mean, the modern Mustangs, the modern Ford GT is remarkable. It's a gorgeous car. I will put one little caveat in that. I had the pleasure of going to the British Museum of Science and Technology some years ago when I was over at Goodwood. And I got to see in their museum a cutaway of the same type engine you people are so proud of today. 4 overhead cams, Hemi head, all aluminum head, all aluminum block, steel crankshaft with roller bearings. Absolutely gorgeous piece. And what stuck in my mind was the fact that it was a 1916 Hispano-Suiza aircraft engine. State of the art, exactly what you people love today. But it's been around for 100 years. And it's not so much that your cars today have new technology in the mechanical end of it. It's the emission system, the fuel injection system, the electronic ignition that controls the spark and makes it happen. And that's where my company has fallen down, because we didn't know about that stuff. We take a dual point distributor and that's state of the art, that's what we do. And now you have to have computers, you have to have the technology to achieve the emissions, to achieve the performance that you people have come to think is normal. If you take your Mustang and my old Mustang, y'all have beat me every time. And I can come up with all kinds of horsepower, but the modern cars have it, and it just comes sort of naturally with it. It takes a lot of maintenance, it takes a lot of concern to keep it there. So what we found at Holman Moody now, since our technology is getting so old, and most of our customers are getting so old, nobody can remember who the hell we were. So we have started a new company, Holman Moody Performance, up in Connecticut, and we're starting to produce products for the new Mustangs, the new Ford Fusion, the new Ford Focus, and we're coming out with lines of service parts, service vehicles, and just like Carol Shelby said, I've got to get one of those Fiestas. We've already got one. The difference is when we asked Ford for it, they said, who the hell's Holman Moody? So we bought our own. And we're working on it. We've got some prototype pieces here. Our company is going to continue into the future. We're going to continue working on the modern cars. my guys in Charlotte, I'm having to drag them in kicking and screaming because right now we still don't allow anything newer than 1970 in the building. But that's going to change. We're going to start doing modern stuff and getting into the modern era. But in the meantime, if you happen to need any old stuff, or you need an old car done or fixed up, we kind of can do that. We know how to make them go fairly well. I really have enjoyed this meeting up here, the event. The cars on the track are lovely, the performance of the cars. I want to thank Tony and Marcy for inviting us up with my family. It's a wonderful event. It's fun to see how much appreciation the old Ford history has. We are certainly part of that history. I lived through most of it. I'm the only guy here in the room that in 1965 was forced to go to Europe to work on the Allen Man race team to fuel the Cobra Coupes racing in Europe with Ford credit cards in my pocket, a Ford car to drive for free in Europe. And I was forced to live in Europe for over 6 months under those conditions. We raced at Le Mans, Reims, Nürburgring, and I've got a picture in my shop of a very much thinner person fueling the Cobra Coupes. So if you have any questions or want to know anything about any of this type of history, I can pretty much tell you what really happened and where most of the bones are buried. It's sure a pleasure to be here, and we'll be here tomorrow, and if you have any questions or want to come by and look at my Mark II or look at my old Fireball car that I have, which is one of our original, that is a real 63 car, team car, driven by Fireball Roberts. It was also driven by Fred Lorenzen and Junior Johnson, because like I said earlier, we were a factory, and if you wrecked a car, you would put it in the back door and grab the one at the front door. And so most of these cars had 8 or 10 different drivers. And so when you see these articles in the paper about this car was driven by Fred Lorenzen, wrong. It was driven by just about everybody. Because those cars had little or no value except for what they could do on Sunday. And so they come in, get rebuilt, and spit out the front. And so just like my car was driven by Freddie, I can document Fred Lorenzen, Fireball Roberts, and Junior Johnson drove that car in races in NASCAR. And there's very few out there that can be documented like that. Any questions?
We covered a lot.
From above.